So like when I think of profound additional impact, I think of my own experience in the classroom. I am a first generation American. My parents are Colombian. And I grew up in a very similar background as my students. I grew up in a one-bedroom apartment where the four of us shared one room. I didn't actually have a bed. And so in coming in, I thought, you know what, I'm going to be really good at this because I am Latino. My students are Latino. We both come from disadvantaged backgrounds, but I've made it. I'm like a Latino man who's made it. I've gone to like college. I'm here working for Teach for America. Like, I've made it. And that's what I went in. My idea was going into my school thinking like, I'm going to help these kids make it too. And so Colombian Spanish is very different than Mexican Spanish, and a lot of things I would correct my students. I would say, no, you don't say it like that, you say it this way. I would always like ask my students to button up their polos, like really simple little things, but actually in retrospect have really had a big impact on our relationship because I wasn't actually valuing what they were. But I didn't realize this at the time. I realized it when it was Mexican Independence Day, and in our school we do like a Mexican Independence Day parade. And I took out my kids wearing piñatas because I thought, you know, that's really Mexican. I think that's what we'll do, and I did. And it wasn't until a coworker asked me why my kids were wearing piñatas, and I said, well, isn't that like what Mexican Independence Day is about? Like, and she's like, no, that's actually not Mexican Independence Day. And I felt so, at that moment, I felt so ignorant, like I hadn't actually made any connections, because here I was thinking that I was going to make my students make it, and I was just telling them how to live their lives, telling them that their culture wasn't important, when it was so similar to my own culture. And so when I think of profound additional impact, I think, okay, it's actually about recognizing that we might be similar, but there are actually so many differences within that similarity. And recognizing that and valuing that is so important. And what it meant, that was like a shift in my mindset about how I run my classroom and how I develop a relationship with my students, my parents, and my school. I didn't want it to be, here I am to save you. It's actually, let me bring out the best in all of you, my parents, my students, and my school. And that's actually what I think made a really big difference for my 2 years, is really understanding that shift. And that has just been really helpful in building those relationships and making them stronger, because it's not about helping people become me, but helping people become the best of themselves that they can become. And I think that is what profound additional impact is. And I think it's when you go that extra step further to understand someone and understand who they are, where they're coming from, in relationship to your own kind of self-discovery, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. That was perfect. How else do you feel like, maybe after the Mexican Independence Day incident, or before potentially, how do you feel like you worked to get to understand your kids?
Before that case?
Yeah.
I think before the situation with the Mexican independence, I was very much coming from a place like, I am here to save you guys. And so I don't think I actually did enough to understand my students.
Yeah.
I think I understood them at a surface level, in terms of like, this is the community that's disenfranchised, this is a community that like has violence, this is a community and students that are challenged, and also I have special ed students, so I said, my students don't know as much. So I think it came from like all of these layers of ignorance that I actually wasn't making connections that were at all meaningful. It was just about understanding kind of the surface level of the situation and not really investing in people, but really investing in who I wanted them to become.
Yeah. And once that happened and you kind of became much more aware that you had been doing that, what are some of the things that you did in class or maybe with parents to start to try to undo or get to know better who they were?
I think, so I did two things. I think one was like really apologize. I apologized to my students, I apologized to my parents. I said that and my students are like first graders, but I think it was still important for them to hear that I'm really sorry, and to really, I tried to understand more about Mexican culture and like what that looks like, because I'm from the East Coast there in New York. it's not really very Mexican.
Yeah.
So really understanding what that means and how the community functions. Like I started going outside every morning of our school, like talking to the woman that sells tamales, talking to my parents, inviting them to my classroom. And that was a better way to understand who they were. Like I asked my parents where they worked. My students would bring me things, and I could see that we were like making a stronger connection.
Yeah.
And I think that was important because I hadn't done that before.
Yeah, excellent. How would you compare, and particularly given this is the end of your second year, how would you compare the progress you've made this year or the relationships you've built this year versus last year?
Yeah. So I was really fortunate enough to loop with my students.
Great.
So I think that, I mean, if I just think of my first year, by the end of my first year, our relationship was pretty strong with my parents and my students. I think parents understood that I really valued who their students were, and what this community was about. I think they saw me as part of this community, which is, I think, a big jump.
Yeah.
I think this year, I think that relationship has grown exponentially. I think it's empowered me, and I think it's allowed me to have like deeper and more kind of grittier conversations with my parents and concerning about what it means for their child to be special education, what it means to be in this community and like the potential that students have, and really challenge parents to really like believe their child is capable of more. Because before I was like kind of weary of really bringing certain things up, but because our relationship is that much stronger, I think I'm able to accomplish so much more with my parents, like really make sure that their students are getting what they need.
Yeah.
Especially now that I'm leaving the classroom, really empowering my parents to be advocates for their child, and be advocates for themselves too.
Yeah. How would you describe the like trust that exists between you and parents? Do you feel like it is, I don't know, like it sounds like they listen to you, and now you mentioned earlier like they view you as part of the community. What are some pieces of evidence that like let you know that's true?
Yeah. I think parents are very they trust me with their child. I know that's like very general, but I think like parents know that I will always be there at this time for their child, or if parents come late, I'll be waiting with their child. But I also think that it presents itself in like IEP meetings when I'm advocating for the parent and like really pushing the parent to say what they really mean.
Yeah.
And I think because they seem kind of afraid sometimes or unsure if like what they're saying is right. And really, I think that level of trust is there to like push parents, like say, no, like you have the opportunity to say this, so you can say this. I think where it becomes kind of troubling for me is I don't want to become that person that's saying like you should say this, or like my parents are so trusting that sometimes they want to push the power back on me.
Yeah.
To really direct things, and I think that is a fine line, because I want them to be more empowered.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you, Matthew.
Yeah.